Hello, welcome to tonight's Travel Talk, the collapse of the Bronze Age and the birth of the Greek gods with John Larison. The OSU Alumni Association's online Travel Talk series is our way of connecting OSU experts and the places we go with our group travel program. Welcome. Before we begin, I have just a few reminders to let you know about. The chat is open during the talk, so feel free to say hello to each other or type in any questions or comments during the presentation. You can also use the Q&A box, which are both at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to check those out. This presentation is being recorded. You'll receive an email in a couple days following with a link to the recording if you'd like to watch it again or share it with a friend. And then all of our talks, as you know, are also recorded and you can see those online. And just to recap quickly, tonight's talk is our last in the series for this season. And what an amazing Travel Talk series we've had. We learned about sustainable seafood with Dr. Selena Happel. Bob Lilly walked us through plate tectonics with an Oreo and the similarities between the mountain ranges across the big pond or the ocean. Julie Lambert told us all about the holiday markets tour. Julia Bradshaw gave us tips on travel photography. Dave Stone taught us about sustainable agriculture in the Netherlands. And we heard presentations on Costa Rica, Uganda, Botswana, and so much more. So if you haven't seen any of those, you'll want to check them out. They're recorded. So don't worry, we'll be back in the fall with more travel talks, and we'll send out an email probably about late August with the upcoming season of presentations. So look for that. But we are going to take the summer off, just like our students do. Before we begin, I have to let you know that there's a number of tours that just opened for bookings. So on our website, we had some placeholders of brochure coming soon. Well, those brochures are now there. So if any of these tours you had your eye on, you'll want to check them out. The ones that you see on your screen right now that are in the orange color, those are exclusive OSU tours, meaning that they're Oregon State travelers and friends of Oregon State. Some of our other tours, we do partners with other schools, but these ones are Oregon State ones. So check them out, and maybe there's something that you want to go on in 2025. Now, on to tonight's talk. So how does the collapse of the Bronze Age and the birth of the Greek gods relate to where we travel? Well, you're in for a treat. Tonight, John Larison, OSU senior instructor and author, will lead the way. You may know him from his Los Angeles Times and Seattle Times best-selling novel, Whiskey When We're Dry. It's a great book. I've read it. You should read it too. John is an Oregon native, and he's the son of a National Geographic filmmaker, and he spent much of his childhood traveling. Not only is he a novelist and a professor, he is also a fly fishing instructor and a past whitewater guide. So he's been around in a lot of cool places. His new novel, The Ancients, is set to release on October 15, and it has been selected as a buzz book by Publisher Marketplace. So at the end of the talk, maybe John will tell us a little bit more about this next novel. Well, for now, welcome, John. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yes.
Hello, all. Thanks for joining me. I'm just so excited. This is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, and I teach this here at OSU, a classical mythology class. And really what we're going to be talking about today, I hope changes the way that you experience the Mediterranean the next time you're there, and maybe changes the way you think about Greek myth generally. But the core idea here tonight is that I'm going to talk about the archaeological history of the Mediterranean and then try to connect that to the Greek myths that maybe you've heard of before, maybe you've actually read some of them yourselves. But I'm guessing even if you haven't read them, you've probably heard some of these names that we're going to be hearing about tonight. And you know, these Greek myths are really all around us. Maybe you were introduced to the Odyssey in high school or college, but young people today are experiencing these myths just all over in popular culture. Percy Jackson has been huge for young beavers at OSU. When I started teaching this class, we usually had about 50 people. Now we have 300 with a waiting list, and next year it looks like we'll be offering it to 500 students, maybe twice during the year. So there's really a lot of interest at OSU in this content. Um, and maybe you've heard of some of these Greek gods, the Olympians. Zeus being the most prominent. But I've provided a list here, and I won't walk you through each of these. But if you look them over, what you might get a sense of is that these gods each represent some element of the human experience. We have Aphrodite, the god of love. We have Hephaestus, the god of crafts. Dionysus, the god of wine, merriment. And really, these gods helped the ancient Greeks make sense of the world around them. So, if there was a big earthquake and a tsunami came and swamped the island, well, then the ancient Greeks would probably blame their king and feel like their king had not given enough offerings to Poseidon, who controls the ground and the ocean. And so really that's what these Greek gods were about for the Greeks, helping them make sense of the world around them. And what we know about these gods mostly come from these two characters here, Hesiod and Homer. And I can talk more about their specific works if you're interested in the question and answer period, but these people were storytellers about 750 BCE, and they are the oldest storytellers that we have remaining that give us a glimpse on these old stories. And so tonight I'm going to be exploring the idea, are the Greek myths cultural memories of conquest and collapse? So the Mediterranean region, hopefully you can see my cursor here, but this is the Mediterranean region, of course. We have, Italy, we have Greece. Here's the island of Crete, Egypt. We have Syria, Israel. And this area was just a hub of bustling civilization about 5,000 years ago. Copper, and as a technology, really built this area up and allowed humans to work together to kind of become like hives of individuals working together for a collective good. Copper tools could be made quickly. They could be mass produced, and they allowed large numbers of people to work in the fields, for instance, plowing and planting. And those crops they grew allowed more people to survive, more children to grow up and become adults who were then able to work. So the human population in the region really just explodes during the Copper Age because it was such an effective tool for getting people to work. And of course, nobody was better at copper than the Egyptians. Here's an ancient image of Egyptians smelting copper. You can see right here how they're using sticks to hold this very hot bowl of molten metal, and they're pouring it into forms. And their use of copper allowed, combined with their terrific agricultural potential of the landscape they were in, allowed Egypt to become the civilization that we have all heard so much about and been learning about for so long. Egypt's cool, but I'm really interested in Crete. Crete is a special island in this time period. It has fertile valleys, but nothing like the Nile Delta. It has some pasture land, but it's a lot of scrub brush in this time period. And yet, despite the sort of lack of clear ecological, resource value of the area, the inhabitants here really thrived in an exciting way. They're known in pop culture as the Minoans. They are known to the Egyptians as the Keftiu, and they are especially well known for a few things that I'd like to just talk about tonight. One of them is their pottery work, and they were famous 3,000 years ago for their pottery work. Here are 5,000-year-old vessels that were created. You can just see, the artwork and the attention to detail here on these vessels. It's abstract work, and there's really just a lot going on here. They're also famous in this time period for their ability to create the most valuable substance on Earth, which was purple dye. Purple dye was far more valuable than gold. And the only way people could get purple dye at this time was from seashells. And each one of these seashells actually only produces about a pinprick of dye. So in order to create enough dye to dye your cloak, or Cleopatra, thousands of years later, would dye her sails on her ships purple. In order to create that amount of purple, somebody had to raise thousands of these shells. And the early inhabitants of Crete figured out how to mass produce these shells through aquaculture. And they became phenomenally rich because of their ability to distribute purple dye. Here's a depiction of the Keftiu or the Minoans from an Egyptian tomb, a pictograph. This middle row here are people from Crete, and this is about 3000 BCE. And what you'll notice is they have their vessels, right, that the Egyptians really admired. And you also see that they're wearing clothes that have a lot of purple dye in them, which at the time period would be like wearing gold jewelry. And these people have come to pay tribute to a new pharaoh. They're bringing presents for the new pharaoh. You'll see people from all parts of the world at this point in time bringing presents for the pharaoh. Just fascinating, I think, to get this glimpse back in history. And these inhabitants of Crete are really interesting in some other ways. So this palace that they created, the Knossos Palace, is 4 times bigger than the Buckingham Palace in terms of landmass. It's also much higher and deeper. So it goes underground here, multiple layers and many layers on top. It's a huge structure. Even in this time period, for today, it's a huge structure. But back then, it was just like almost unparalleled, maybe unparalleled in the ancient world. And what makes it so interesting to me is that this giant palace does not have a throne. Nowhere in here is there a throne, which suggests to archaeologists that maybe the inhabitants of this place didn't have like royalty. They didn't have kings and queens or pharaohs. Maybe they had a different system of governance. But also noteworthy is that nowhere on the island of Crete at this time period were there any fortifications. These were not a militaristic people. The archaeological records suggest that they didn't have an army or any sort of defense, which is quite noteworthy for the time period. And they're most famous in popular culture for their love of bull jumping. So this is an ancient fresco. This one's about 3,500 years old. And what you can see here is a person who is leaping onto the back of a bull. Here's an artist's rendition of what they were actually doing. So they would tempt the bull into charging them. And then when the bull got to them, the athlete here would grab the horns of the bull and ride that bull's thrust upward into the air, do a flip, land on the back, and then do one more flip and land on the ground. And so what these people were doing was really, it seems like maybe people were coming together for this sporting event, or maybe it wasn't a sporting event, maybe it was a religious ritual, but clearly this practice of bull jumping is really important to these people. They also seem to have prayed to a unique kind of God. This is a really old figurine from Crete, probably about 3,500 years old, maybe 4,000 years old. You'll notice here the chest of this person. To us, this might seem like a sexualized image, but it appears to the ancient inhabitants of Crete that this was actually a display of power, possibly mourning, possibly a trance-like religious state. But also you'll notice the snakes. This figure has snakes on her hat. She has snakes in her hands. Here's another one. Again, the chest, again, the snakes going up the arms. This is a person who has venomous snakes on them, and especially on their head. You can see this is actually a snake wound around their hat, and the snake's head is up here. And people were wrapped by this figure. It's possible that these figurines actually had, human equivalents, like priestesses that the people were coming to pray to, and that these were the central religious figures for these early inhabitants of Crete. Well, the Bronze Age really changes things in the region. So copper, as you might know, is a soft metal. And if you make a blade out of copper, it's not very sharp. It's not really a good blade. Rock is much better, actually, than copper for cutting. But at about 2300 BCE, people in the region realized that if you take copper and you add about 10% tin, 90% copper, 10% tin, you can create bronze, which is just so much stronger. Bronze can hold an edge. It can cut really well. If you make a bronze tool, that bronze tool is going to be around for a long time. In fact, we still find bronze from this period in archaeological digs. It's lasted this long, but especially for tools like digging, agricultural tools, bronze could keep its shape and allow people to work harder for longer. And so bronze allowed these civilizations to really expand. But in order to get bronze, you had to have tin, and tin's not everywhere. Copper is really all over the place. Iron is all over the place. People couldn't melt iron yet at this point in time. But tin is rare. And in order to get the tin that people needed in this part of the world, they had to create a trade network that went all the way over into Afghanistan and really remote parts of the world from the Mediterranean. And so what happened is these really complex trade lines developed with alliances between cultures, mutual defense agreements, really the hallmarks of the globalized world. Like, we still have those structures today. And those structures were being created in this time period so that tin could move from all the way in Asia all the way to the Mediterranean. And there's this great detail that I've learned about a king here who saw a pair of sandals that he really liked from a kingdom right here. And so he sent a note to the king saying, hey, can I have a pair of those sandals? Well, the king had a pair of sandals made for him, had them shipped back over to here. And this king tried them on and was like, I don't like how they fit. And so he shipped them back. It's kind of like Amazon return policy or something. But I think that just goes to show how connected these people were and how, in a sense, globalized their world was. And tin allowed people to mass produce tools that were really effective for getting work done. And as a result, these cities exploded. Just so many more people were able to be supported on the landscape by these cities. And so the human population in the region just continues to increase in this time period. And all the hallmarks of urban civilization that we see today, those are all present in this Bronze Age period in the Mediterranean. High-rise buildings, apartments, people working together in businesses. There were agricultural workers, there were middle-class people, there were shopkeepers, and of course royalty. So it's a really complex, stratified culture and cultures that arise all over the region. So what I just showed you is a city in Iraq. Here is Ugarit, a city in Syria. And you can just see how complex these cities become in the Bronze Age. Well, back on Crete, the Minoans, the Keftiu who were on Crete at the time, they really profit from this time period. As their neighbors get richer, their demand for their trade goods really explodes. And so all of a sudden, palaces start popping up all over. and other sorts of settlements start popping up all over Crete. And it really becomes the golden age for the inhabitants of Crete. Evidence of their trading success can be found in the copious jewelry and gold jewelry that is being unearthed on Crete even today from this time period. And you can just see how complex some of these pieces of jewelry are. Really, incredible works. And their own homegrown artwork really takes off in this time period too. Here is a stone bull with gold dipped horns. Just an incredible find. You can imagine the archaeologist who dug this up. It must have just been amazing. And to the north at this same time period, also profiting off the Bronze Age, is a very different culture that we call now the Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans are different than the Minoans in just about every way. So first of all, here's Crete once again. Here is Mycenae. And the Mycenaeans, here is a artistic rendition of the city of Mycenae. And what you might notice first is this defensive wall. So outside this wall are the fields, are the agricultural workers, their houses. But it's clear that this city was coming under attack all the time. And that when it came under attack, those people that lived outside would rush inside the gates and be protected from an attack. Also, there's a palace, a giant palace, and it's actually all built around a throne. It's all about a throne and a king and a queen. And so this looks much more like the castles that we're familiar with in Northern Europe thousands of years later. But the Mycenaeans, they know that the Minoans are rich. And so they start coming down from the north. And their influence in the region really expands. So you can see here about 1400 BCE, the Mycenaean influence expands. They end up on Crete, and their culture begins to replace the culture of the inhabitants that were there. It could have been colonization. It could have been like a war. We're not really sure. But what's interesting is that there's a period of time on Crete where the language of the Minoans, Linear A, exists at the same time as the language of the Mycenaeans, Linear B. And this is Linear B here, and we have decoded that. We know what this says. Here is a Linear A. We've never been able to decode Linear A. It's still a mystery, but we have lots of these clay tablets, and they're probably mostly receipts. In this time period, people are trading, and you want to keep a record of that. But if we could decode Linear A, we'd just know so much more about the Minoan civilization. The Mycenaeans from the north, they really like that pottery that the Minoans were making, and they start making their own versions of it. And you'll notice the difference, right? The Minoans had these abstract works. The Mycenaeans have these militarized artworks on their vessels. And the Mycenaeans bring their own gods too. We don't know the name of this god, but it's clearly a male god. And it starts to appear in about 1450 on the island of Crete, just all over the place. And it appears like there was some conflict, some sort of religious conflict between those people who prayed to this young male god and people who prayed to the snake goddess. The evidence for that is that we find lots of these figurines that have been intentionally destroyed in the archaeological record. This one is especially potent, I think. So this is that male god, and someone hated this male god enough to grind off the genitalia and carve off the face. Then they broke this thing on a very specific rock. We know exactly which rock the person broke it on. But then they went and they gathered up the pieces and they threw the pieces into a fire. And you can see how this ivory figurine was burned in places. Those are the pieces that ended up in the fire. Archaeologists found all these little pieces and pieced this thing back together, just sort of like the epic jigsaw puzzle. But it's clear that somebody hated this god. Somebody destroyed this god really intentionally. And that suggests some sort of conflict, religious conflict happening on that island. Also fascinating is that the Mycenaean influence on Crete arrives at the same time as a throne. So this is the Knossos Palace, and you'll see a throne here. This throne was added to the palace in 1450 BCE. The palace had been around probably 1500 years, and then a new culture shows up, and the first thing they do is put a throne in the palace. And so could it be that the Greek myths that you've maybe heard about are offering a window onto the Mycenaean conquest of Crete? Well, one clue might be Medusa. If you've ever heard of Medusa, the myth of the Gorgons, Perseus, you might remember that Medusa has snakes for hair, which is just so interesting. And of course, that conjures memories of this goddess figurine who has snakes on her arms and snakes through her hair. Well, Perseus, goes on his epic journey and he kills Medusa by cutting her head off. And he brings that head back to the Mycenaean world. And he, according to myth, goes on to found Mycenae. He's the founding king of the city. The mythical king Minos, you might have heard of him. Early archaeologists who found that throne were just convinced this was the actual guy who was sitting in that throne on Crete. Well, there are a lot of great stories about him in Greek myth. One is the myth of the Minotaur. So I won't give you the whole story here for time reasons, but the gist is King Minos' wife falls for a white bull, and she mates with that white bull. It's quite a story. The students at OSU just love it when we talk about that story. They're also a little horrified. But the offspring from King Minos' wife and this white bull creates the Minotaur, which is half man, half bull. And Theseus, a Mycenaean, comes to Crete and manages to slay the Minotaur. And in doing so, he frees his people from their yearly tribute that they were offering the Mycenaean or the Minoans, where prominent people from the city the Mycenaean city had to go there and die. Well, according to myth, Theseus goes on to found Athens. So again, we have a Mycenaean hero goes to Crete, kills somebody, comes home, and becomes a prominent king. And of course, there's Daedalus and the Labyrinth and Icarus, and you might know these stories, but it's hard for archaeologists to overlook how labyrinthian this palace is. It's got just so many corridors and dead-end paths in here under the ground. And it really, no doubt, must have felt like a labyrinth to people who came to it and visited and wandered through its corridors. And so possibly the Mycenaeans are, telling the story of Daedalus and the labyrinth, and they're remembering this palace here that existed on the island. But all of this comes to a crashing end in about 1177 BCE. This is really where the story gets interesting, I think. So at the time period, you can see how many civilizations are thriving before the collapse. But you can also notice in this world how on the edge of prosperity the Mycenaean world is. They don't have the land connections to the wealth that everyone else does. They're reliant on their ships to get that wealth. And you kind of wonder if they had a little chip on their shoulder. Well, what happens in about 1200 BCE is every city in the region is destroyed. And every city is destroyed in just a few years, maybe 50 years. Definitely in one lifetime, all the major cities of the region outside of Egypt are destroyed. And archaeologists for a long time couldn't figure out why that happened. It was hard to explain. but we've learned some new things that shed light on this mystery. So what's clear is that the region experienced extreme environmental stresses, the kinds of things that maybe we can imagine happening with climate change now. For instance, extreme drought hit the region, about a 300-year drought, really dried up fields. There was a storm of earthquakes right about in this region. You can imagine if you live in a city and there's an earthquake and your house falls down, and then you rebuild the house, and a year later there's another earthquake and the house falls down. Boy, you're going to get pretty stressed out about that, obviously. And you might actually blame the royalty who are supposed to be appeasing the gods. But gosh, if they're doing a bad job of it, if the earthquakes keep happening. And then there's also the eruption of this Icelandic volcano called Hekla that happens at about this same time. And all evidence suggests that the Earth was completely in a dark state for about 2 years after the eruption of Hekla. It's possible that no crops were growing for 2 years. And if you're a city that is, a really well-funded city at this time, you might have a year's worth of provisions stockpiled, but you don't have 2 years of provisions stockpiled. So it's quite possible that the people in the Mediterranean region at about this time, due to natural events, are extremely stressed. Their systems are stressed as well. But there's this other clue that we've unearthed. And so this is a note which hopefully I can move. Yeah, there we go. So this note, we found it. It's a clay tablet. King Amurapi wrote this to his father. And this is what he wrote. He said, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." Well, this tablet never made it to Amurapi's father. Amurapi appears to have been killed. The entire city was burned. Archaeologists have found where people quickly buried anything valuable that they had in the center of their house in the ground. And then those people ran out their doors, and a lot of them were killed, just shot in the back with arrows and left in the streets. These cities were totally sacked and burned. The valuables that the invaders found, they stole. But this is the fate of all those cities I showed you earlier through the region in this time period. And there's a hint here: the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. So that note and several others like it have led archaeologists to believe that there was an invasion in the Mediterranean by a group of people that they've called the Sea Peoples, and that this invasion happened right about that time period. Here's an artist's rendition of what these people might have looked like. Here is an Egyptian work of art representing the Sea Peoples. And it's clear these people just came and raided one city at a time and just destroyed every city in the region. We can trace the timing of that destruction and get a sense that these people started over here and moved through the region this way. But when they hit Egypt, things didn't go well for them. Ramses III, a pharaoh at the time period, knows that these people are coming, and he prepares for them. Here's his account of an account that is attributed to Ramses of the battle. This battle seems to have occurred in 1177 BCE. Now the northern countries, which were in their isles, were quivering in their bodies. They penetrated the channels of the Nile's mouths. Their nostrils have ceased to function, so that their desire is to breathe the breath. His Majesty has gone forth like a whirlwind against them, running on the battlefield like a runner. The dread of him and the terror of him have entered in their bodies. They are capsized and overwhelmed in their places. Their hearts are taken away. Their soul is flown away. Their weapons scattered in the sea. You can imagine how intense this must have been. Ramses has been hearing about all of these cities in his trading world falling to this sea people's invasion, and now they've arrived here. And he seems to have won in the battle against them, the first civilization to be able to do so. Here is a relief from his tomb that depicts the battle, and you can see ships being overturned. You can see lots of bronze spears being stabbed into people. You can see the archers on the shore that seem to have been throwing arrows out into the ships. It must have been a horrific battle that was partly naval, partly on land, but the sea peoples seem to have lost. Here is different Egyptian depictions of the sea peoples after the battle. What you might notice is just how brutally the Egyptians bound their captives. But you'll also notice these differences in headdress between the sea peoples. They're not a consistent army or a navy. They seem to be a compilation of many groups of people, and they seem to be operating without a clear leader of their military. They don't seem to be guided by a king or a pharaoh. They seem to be a compilation of different peoples. And that leads us to wonder, where did these sea people come from? Well, not all the sea peoples died in the battle. This person here, you've seen this image before, this is one of the members of the sea peoples, and this is a person known as a member of the Peliset group. Well, the Peliset saw that they were losing the battle and seemed to have turned around and left the Nile. And they went and they settled in what is now Israel, in Ashkelon. And recent genetic analysis of tombs that were unearthed there show that these people are actually genetically from Sicily, Italy. There's another great bit of evidence. An earlier Egyptian pharaoh talked about another city falling, and he actually mentions the specific groups of people that attacked that city. He mentions these names here, the Lekwesh and the Luka, specifically. And we don't know who those three of those groups are, but we know who the Luka are. They're right here from coastal Anatolia. And we know who the Ekwesh were. They're the Mycenaeans. So what appears to have happened is that the Mycenaeans possibly began this series of invasions. And as they attacked a city, they found people who were also kind of pissed at their leaders and willing to join the combat. You can imagine if you're really hungry, if you don't have food for your family, you might think that your best chance of feeding your family is to join this raiding party that's going to go attack your rich neighbors, steal what they have, use what they have to feed your family. That might be what's happening here. And there's a great bit of evidence to support this theory in Mycenae itself, because Mycenae is the only one of these red X's anywhere in the region where the entire city isn't destroyed. Only the palace was destroyed in Mycenae, suggesting that it's quite possible that the citizens of Mycenae got mad enough at their own leadership that they sacked the palace. Once the palace was sacked, there was no one to organize harvests anymore. And it's possible that those people became so desperate that they started this invasion throughout the region. But if you know your history of this region, you might be thinking about Troy, because the Trojan War is said to have happened at about 1200 BCE. The archaeological evidence from Troy suggests that there was a 10-year war right about that period where the city of Troy was sacked. And this is an artist's rendition of what that area might have looked like in this time period. And if you've heard of the Trojan War, you've probably heard of the Trojan horse. This is, according to myth, how the Greek forces, the allied Greek forces, the Mycenaeans, came into the city walls was by hiding their best fighters inside the belly of a horse. And then when night fell, they descended and opened the gates to the full army and then burned the city to the ground. That story of the Trojan War is told in the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad is the story of the last year of the war, and the Odyssey is the story of one of the famous fighters, Odysseus, and his 10-year journey to get home. Here is a scrap of the story from the oldest text we have, which is only about 1,000 years old. This story was being passed through the ages, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But I want to argue that possibly these stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are actually a glimpse into the conquest of the region from the Sea People's own perspective. This is a long passage, so I'm going to skim some of it. You'll be able to look back at it at your own time if you want to look at it in more detail. There's also a citation here, so if you want to look at the Odyssey and read this passage yourself, you can. But this is Odysseus talking, and he says that after we sacked Troy, which is also called Priam, he came home and he stayed with his children and wife for just a month. And then some impulse made him want to sail to Egypt with 9 ships and a godlike crew. And they have easy sailing to get there. They finally reach the river valley of Egypt, and his fleet docks inside the Nile. And he tells his loyal men to wait and guard the ships, but instead they indulge their own aggressive impulses and willfully doing damage to the fields of Egypt and enslaving the little children and women and killing the men. And when news reaches the city, well, the Egyptian army descends on them. The plain was filled with warriors on foot and chariots and gleaming bronze, and Zeus, the Lord of lightning, caused my men to panic. They dared not keep fighting. Danger lurked on every side. Then many of my men were killed with sharp bronze spears. The rest were taken as slaves to work for them. This snippet from the Odyssey, if you know the archaeological history, you can't help but feel the resonances between Ramses' versions of events and Homer's version of events. What happens after 1177 is all those trade networks have collapsed because the cities are gone, the powerful people are dead, and as a result, everyone is taking care of just themselves. For about 400 years, writing in the region vanishes. The Greeks forget how to write. And all of our versions of these myths are being passed orally for 400 years during this time period. From about 1200 BCE to 800 BCE, there's no writing, but these are stories that are being told. Usually a poet shows up in a powerful person's house and entertains those people, and then moves on to another place and tells a story there. In about 800 BCE, writing returns to the region, and orators like Hesiod and Homer are transcribed by literate people. And as more people become literate, they record the stories as they heard them. In the classical period, in the 400 BCE range, scholars, Plato, Aristotle, those types of people are debating these myths as they know them. And then for about 1,300 years, there's a series of these texts being lost to age, war, and fires. And we lose almost all the myths that existed and were written down. We know that they existed because we hear the scholars talk about them, but we don't have those texts because they were lost. And our oldest version of these stories date back to just 500 to 1,000 years ago, which is really not very long. That means that these stories were being translated and retranslated for 2,000 years before they were locked in sort of, stone in the versions that we have. And so perhaps the Greek myths can be read as cultural memories of conquest and collapse. And if that's the case, I think what's interesting is to think about what they can teach us about how and why civilizations collapse. And also on the positive side, what they can teach us about how human communities and cultures endure. Yeah, so as you can see, I'm like super into this. I'm really fascinated by this, and I'm glad to say that OSU students seem to be as well. I hope this has been fun. I'd love to answer, any questions if you have them.
Wow. I was just, oh, my camera just froze. I was just in Turkey this past fall in Winter Troy, and
Oh,
man, all this is just coming to life. What an amazing presentation. And to think of what changed with the histories, if it was oral histories for so many years and everything being lost and then rewritten, how did those stories really change over time?
right.
Makes me really wonder.
Yeah, that's
Um,
a great point. Yeah. And we can kind of see the layers of new culture applied to some of the stories when we look deeply. Yeah.
right, right. Anyone that has questions, please do go ahead and start typing them into chat. We have definitely a few minutes and we want to be able to answer all of your questions that you have. And as people are writing down their questions, I know it takes a minute to get your chat open or your Q&A open and start typing them. If somebody wanted to dive into this a little bit more and learn a little bit more, is there, besides the Iliad and the Odysseys, is there other books that you would suggest that
Yeah.
that they would read?
So a great book on the subject, especially if you're interested in the collapse itself, is Eric Klein's book, 1177 BCE. It is a very readable book. It's scholarly, but it's also, I think, written with an eye for popular readers. And it gives you a glimpse inside what life was like in the Bronze Age and then the events that led up to the collapse.
Great. And what was that title one more time?
It's 1177 BC
1177.
by
Okay.
Eric Klein. And he has a fascinating follow-up called After 1177 too, that talks about what happened in that dark age period in the region.
That's great. One of our listeners here, Allie, she has a question of, have you read the book? And I am not going to pronounce this right. Circe.
Oh, Circe.
Um,
Yes, I
yes.
love Circe. Yes. So Odysseus in his journey home ends up at Circe's palace, and she can turn men into pigs, and she's very dangerous and powerful. And in the old story, Odysseus kind of, I would say, kind of gets the upper hand. But in the book by Madeline Miller, Circe, we get to see that story from Circe's point of view, and she's just like even more compelling in that novel than she is in the Odyssey. It's really fascinating. If anybody's interested in these myths, I would suggest reading the Odyssey and reading Circe hand in hand. Yeah.
So Circe makes me also think of the Game of Thrones.
Yes. Yeah.
And would that be one of the namesakes of one of the characters?
So Circe is hugely influential. We may not have the Salem witch trials without Circe. Circe is, one of the early witches that scares the patriarchy. To have a female character who's that powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so really fascinating stuff. Circe is a great book. Thanks for recommending that.
Yeah. Thank you, Ali, for adding that in. A couple more questions are popping in. Um, about another book that specifically connects the historical and religious myths.
Mm. I can't think of a single book that connects these. Um, uh, and yeah, maybe there needs to be one. Maybe somebody should write that book. If somebody has a recommendation for a book I should read along those lines, I'd love to hear it. There really are a lot of books out there, but what's happened is the archaeological evidence, so much of it is really recent, and that's changing the way that people read the myths. And so a lot of what I've talked about here is kind of like new in the last 10 years. So I think those kind of books are going to be coming out with more frequency moving forward. Yeah.
That's neat. Sounds like a really good option for one of your students too.
Yeah, that's right.
Someone's looking for a good thesis project. Um, and then did the eruption in Santorini play a role in the destruction of the Minoan culture too?
Right. I'm so glad you asked that question, whoever did. So, what appears to have happened is the early inhabitants of Crete, who the Egyptians called the Keftiu, were doing really well for themselves. But then Santorini erupts, and there's a giant tsunami, maybe as high as 500 feet, that hits Crete and really destroys Crete in a way that it didn't destroy the Mycenaean world. And as the Keftiu are on their back feet trying to recover from that tsunami and that earthquake, it's quite possible that the Mycenaeans took advantage of their weakness and overwhelmed the island. And there's a lot of evidence to support that theory, especially the timing of Thera, Santorini, the eruption, and the arrival of the Mycenaeans.
Oh, wow, that's great. Well, if anyone else has some questions, feel free to please pop them in to the chat. What were some of maybe the really great conversations or questions that your students have? What sparks their interest when they listen to this presentation or one similar?
But they seem quite interested in that religious shift from maybe worshiping female gods to now worshiping male gods. And one of the things we talk about in the class is how in the Mycenaean world, it appears that Poseidon was actually the big god. And by the time Homer exists, and definitely by the classical period, Zeus is the top god.
Yeah.
And so we talk about how Zeus became the top god. And the answer really is military conquest. As one Greek powerful city state went and attacked another powerful Greek city state, well, if Zeus's people won that war, then the survivors in that new city had to start praying to Zeus. And so pretty soon, Zeus becomes the dominant god in the region and monotheism rises up. And there are a lot of connections with early Judaism and Christianity that come out of this period, including Hades, Tartarus, and even, the Adam and Eve story can be traced, the Noah story. These can all be traced back to this period.
Wow, that's great. Oh, it sounds like you've got some really engaging classes and some interesting ones. Yeah.
It's fun to teach.
Yeah, I bet it is fun to teach. So while we have you, actually, oh wait, we have another question here. Do we see any connections between civilizations that have female gods versus male gods and the balances and the rights and the treatment of men versus women?
I think we would have a lot more insight into that very issue if somebody could figure out how to decode linear A.
Yeah.
Linear A probably would open up a lot of insights into that what looks like a matriarchal or at least feminine divine worship culture. But I will say that we may think of worshiping male gods as being kind of normal, but if you look across history, that appears to be a recent incarnation. It appears that, especially in Europe, people were worshiping female gods for a long time before they started worshiping male gods. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we all came from, a woman, right? And if you don't worship your mom, then you're probably not going to, live a great life.
Or she might remind you of that often.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting to keep in mind. And then also, I think that we're going to learn a lot more about this as more women get into archaeology. The history of archaeology has been a male-dominated field, and they were looking for very specific things. And so now archaeology is really starting to look for new kinds of information. And I think we're going to learn a lot.
So what is it about linear A that makes it so hard to figure out? Is it like an inconsistency of symbols or not enough of
My understanding, having not learned to read linear B, but linear B can be traced back to the European mother tongue, right? The Proto-Euro-Indo-European language. People in India speak a language that is intimately connected with English. Farsi is intimately connected to French. You know, all of these languages come from one family. Linear A, the Keftiu, they were clearly speaking a language that came from a different lineage. And we don't have any ins on that language. And so my understanding is that's the major hurdle, is that's a whole different lineage that appears to have vanished. Yeah.
Wow. Huh. Julie has a question about the linear stone. Says the linear stone predates the Rosetta Stone. Is that correct?
I
And
believe so.
how, yeah, and how would decoding Linear 1 impact history?
Linear, if we can decode linear A, we're going to have, and I would say when we decode linear A, it'll probably be a grad student at some point who's just a genius and does this. We're going to get insights into how materials moved through that culture. And from that, we're going to be able to deduce all sorts of things about how that society was constructed. And from that, you know, we're gonna have just this great insight into the cultural machinations, the movements of culture and materials in that society. And who knows, maybe we'll find a new epic, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. We didn't even know that existed 150 years ago, and it was finding those clay tablets and learning to read the language that allowed us to decode this ancient epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Where we actually see the story of Noah, you know, 1,000 years before it's supposed to have been written. You know, really fascinating discoveries that are, you know, still being made thanks to linguistics and archaeology.
That's really interesting. You know, Nicole just wrote a question that reminded me of something. So Nicole, I'm going to get to your question, but when we were in Turkey and we were at these different sites and at Troy, they were telling us that they're now using artificial intelligence to scan the different ruins and are able to actually to place them back together and rebuild these structures using AI. And Nicole just typed in, do you foresee AI helping with some of this decoding work? So it's a really good question because I know that AI is just changing everything we're doing and seeing it in real time.
Gosh, you know, I know nothing about AI, except that its promise seems limitless. And I would imagine that the people who've been working on linear A are really excited to apply AI technology to that problem and see what they can solve. Yeah, I think that we have every reason to think that there are going to be some really watershed discoveries, major moments in the near future in our understanding of the ancient world.
That's a really good point. Um, and then Lynn, I know we talked about a couple books, the Circe book, 1177 BCE is the other book, and she was wondering about, is there another recommendation for a non-scholar that you really enjoy?
Well, I have to say that the Emily Wilson translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey
Mm-hmm.
are just so approachable. So Emily Wilson is the first woman to translate into English these 3,000-year-old texts. And you might feel daunted by the idea of reading the Odyssey, but I would argue that you're thinking of the Odyssey that maybe you saw in your high school class or something. This Odyssey is very different, and it centers this relationship between a mother and her son, and that wife and her husband, Penelope and Telemachus, her son, and Penelope and Odysseus. And it's just a story that I'm guessing will make you cry. It's can be devastating. It's really powerful. And combining the Odyssey with Circe, I think is great. And if you read the Iliad, the Emily Wilson translation of the Iliad, then I suggest you read The Song of Achilles, which is another Madeline Miller novel. that is about the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, his brother in arms, but also maybe his lover.
That's great. Well, I think we have our summer reading list.
Yeah.
This is wonderful. This is wonderful. Well, you've said the word ancients a couple times, so I want to ask you if you would be willing to tell us a little bit about your new novel that's coming out in October.
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, The Ancients is my new book. It comes out in October, and um, uh, I couldn't have written it without this deep dive into the deep history of humanity. And I'll just tell you that it's set in a deep future that looks a lot more like the ancient past. It's a Bronze Age civilization, and it's I think of it as my anti-apocalypse novel. I feel like I'm at war with that doom and gloom tradition of people looking in the future. And yeah, and I'm kind of trying to push back on that within realism. So I can't wait to talk to people about that book, see if it works for folks, and go on the road and meet readers. Yeah.
Yeah, that is great. Yes, John is going on the road and doing a little bit of a book tour with this one. So we're going to keep an eye out on where he is going and be able to relay some of that information. John, if you wouldn't mind unsharing your screen for a moment. Perfect. And then I don't think we have any other questions. Everyone, you have one last chance to get your questions answered by John. Speak now or forever. You'll just have to recording or maybe email him and be able to ask you a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, then we're just at 6:30, so we're going to say goodnight. Just to want to remind people where to find us. OregonState.org/travel. Of course, all of our tours are up, and remember those few that just opened for bookings. You'll want to check those up. They're all online. And then, as I said a few times, we are recorded and we are posting, so you can catch this talk again. And yes, we are still on Facebook. So if you're still on Facebook, we're there. You can say hello. And then that's all we have for tonight. So thank you very much, John. This has been wonderful. And one last, and one of our attendees says that this was great and thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all. This was really fun for me.
All right. Good night, everyone. And we will see you in the fall. Goodbye.